A sterile millionaire disguised himself as a beggar to find someone to leave his inheritance to. Days later, he was shocked to hear a child call him Daddy. John stared at his reflection in the doctor's office windows, a vision he barely recognized, with his gray hair falling disorderly over a forehead marked by worry lines. He reflected on his weakened physical condition. He had always been a shrewd businessman, but now, faced with his mortality, everything seemed insignificant. He was in his doctor's office, a professional and an old confidant. The doctor looked at the test results with a visibly concerned expression. "John, I need to be frank with you. Without treatment, you have only a few months to live. Even with it, the chance of recovery is small, almost non-existent, but it is a chance," the doctor said. However, John had already made his decision. "Doctor, living a few more months or even years without purpose is like being dead already. I don't have time for treatment. I need to find someone who will make sense of everything I will leave behind. I have a significant inheritance, as you know, and I care about leaving it to someone who knows how to do good with it," John replied, with a determined look, ignoring the shadow of despair that hung over the room. "You need treatment, John. You can't worry about an inheritance when you have a chance at life. You have no heirs, John, and you can't have children, as your tests have shown for years. You should focus on taking care of your health. Forget about your inheritance and take care of yourself," the doctor tried to advise, but John barely listened to him. John had always been a shrewd businessman, but now emotion spoke louder than reason. "How can I think about myself and leave this world without ensuring my legacy endures? I'm sterile. I have no family and no one who cares. This is my chance to do something with what I built," he replied, feeling a growing weight in his chest. Ignoring his doctor's persistent recommendations to begin urgent treatment for his health problems, John chose a different path. "What good is living longer if I have no one to leave everything I've built to? I need to find a way to leave this money to someone who does good, a simple person, but with a good heart. Maybe if I disguise myself as a beggar and found someone who doesn't only care about my financial condition. I think this idea might work," he murmured, more to himself than to the doctor. Determined to proceed with his plan to find someone worthy of his inheritance, John's decision did not come without deep inner conflict. He knew his health was declining, but the idea of dying without leaving a significant impact tormented him more than any medical diagnosis. "John, you need to think about your health first. Without it, there is no legacy to be left," the doctor reinforced, trying once again to convince him to reconsider. But John, with stubborn determination, replied, "What is a legacy without someone to receive it? I need to find a worthy heir, someone who understands the true value of all this." He was willing to risk his health for this search, believing the choice was between living a few more years without purpose or finding someone who could carry on his name. After leaving the office, John went to his mansion and prepared to go out in his disguise, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. He put on torn and dirty clothes, something he never imagined doing, but now he was determined to go ahead with the plan. "Maybe among those who have little or almost nothing, I will find someone who values everything I have built," he thought, trying to justify his decision. As he looked in the mirror one last time before leaving, he murmured, "If this is my last act, let it be meaningful." He knew he was entering unknown territory, but the hope of finding a true successor drove him. John began his disguise with a nervousness mixed with an unfam aurora excitement. He moved through the city streets, trying to disappear into the crowd. For days he watched people pass by him, too busy with their own lives to notice the man who had suddenly become part of the urban landscape. "Will anyone see beyond appearances to find the true value?" he thought, as he went unnoticed among the people walking the streets and ignoring him. The city's indifference was a constant reminder of his mission and the challenge he faced. Time passed slowly, and John felt each day as a test of his determination. The nights were especially difficult, with the biting cold and loneliness weighing on his shoulders. John's illness took its toll. He felt increasingly ill and sought shelter in hidden corners, where he could observe the incessant flow of people, trying to identify some spark of compassion or empathy amid the urban chaos. Even here among those who have little, what I'm looking for seems distant, he reflected, as hope began to waver. The people around him seemed not to notice his presence. It was on one of those nights, when a storm swept through the city, that everything changed. The rain poured down torrentially, soaking his clothes and further chilling his tired body. John found a place under an awning to protect himself from the storm, watching the empty streets illuminated only by occasional lightning. It was then that he noticed a group of young people approaching, their laughter echoing in the night. These young people seem intimidating and looking for trouble. I can't get into problems, especially with my fragile health, John thought, as the young people approached, surrounding him with an energy that was not entirely friendly. The young men, dressed in heavy jackets and hats, surrounded John, and he could feel the tension in the air. "Hey, old man, what are you doing here alone on a night like this? Oh, look, he's shaking from the cold. Or maybe it's from fear. Are you a scared old man?" one of them asked, his tone challenging. John, keeping calm, replied, "I'm just trying to get by, like any of you would." But his words weren't enough to dissuade the youths, whose intentions were already clear. Suddenly, one of the young men lunged at John, pushing and hitting him as the storm raged around them. The attack was brutal and swift, each blow accompanied by laughter that mixed with the sound of rain and thunder. John tried to protect himself, but his age and fragile health made him unable to resist. He fell to the ground, pain exploding in his body as the storm seemed to echo his own internal struggle. Why is the world so cruel to those who are just seeking a bit of dignity? He thought, as darkness began to close in on him. The voices of the young men became distant, and the only thing that remained was the sound of the rain, now sounding like a lament for all he had lost. The rain continued to fall heavily as John lay on the sidewalk, feeling every pain and bruise of a night that seemed endless. The young men kept hitting him, leaving his vision blurred. Then an unexpectedly strong and young voice cut through the darkness. "Stop it! Leave my daddy alone." A boy appeared, bringing with him a determination that challenged the group of young men. Surprised, the attackers hesitated for a moment, then murmured among themselves and retreated, disappearing into the storm. John, still dazed by the assault and the boy's words, blinked to clear his vision and focused on the boy now beside him. "Thank you, but why did you call me Daddy?" I can't have children," said John, his voice a mix of disbelief and confusion, barely believing what he had just heard. With difficulty, he accepted the boy's outstretched hand, each movement protested by his aching body. The boy, with a determined look and eyes shining with concern, replied, "I called you Dad because that's what you are. I am your son. My name is William. My mother told me about you. Let's go home and I will explain everything." Each step alongside William was a challenge for John, but also a discovery. With each stumble, he felt the boy's presence as a support, not just physically but emotionally. I am so tired and confused, but I need to understand what is happening and what this boy said. I can't have children. This could be a trap, but why would he help me if he wanted to harm me? Why does he really look like me? John thought, trying to piece together the unexpected information. The boy walked confidently, guiding John through the wet streets as the rain continued to fall incessantly. "You must have many questions. I know it's confusing, but my mother always said you were important, and that one day I should find you," said William, looking at John with a mix of respect and expectation. John, absorbing every word, felt a mixture of amazement and distrust. "How can this be true if I never could have children?" he reflected, feeling torn between hope and doubt. William's presence was a reminder that even in his darkest hours, the unexpected could bring new challenges. Finally, they arrived at a small, modest house. The door opened to a warm and welcoming interior. William entered first, calling out loudly for someone. "Mom, I'm home. I brought someone you need to see." John hesitated at the threshold, still uncertain of what to expect. A woman appeared from inside the house, drying her hands on a dish towel. Upon seeing him, her expression changed from tiredness to shock. "Oh, John, it can't be. How did you end up here? What are those clothes?" What happened to you?" Her voice was full of disbelief, and he realized with a twinge of surprise that he was standing in front of Eliza, his ex-girlfriend. She looked different, but it was definitely her. Eliza looked at him with a mix of recognition and surprise, her expression reflecting a blend of emotions that John could barely understand. "Eliza, I didn't know you lived here. I just had some trouble with some boys a few blocks from here, and William helped me. But I'm very confused about all this," he began, feeling vulnerable under her intense gaze. She shook her head, still processing his presence. "I thought I'd never see you again, and now you show up like this after so many years," she finally said, her voice trembling a bit. The tension in the air was palpable, and John felt like an intruder in a world he no longer knew. "William found me. He said he is my son. Son. But you know that I am sterile. I'm sorry, but this boy can't be my son," said John, trying to make sense of the loose pieces of his life. Eliza sighed, running a hand through her hair. "John, William is your son. I am sure of it. Maybe there was a mistake with your diagnosis or something like that, but I know he is yours." Her conviction left John stunned. "How can this be possible? I have taken several tests in different labs, with different doctors. There is no way William can be mine. Even though he seems like a good boy, I would like him to be. But it's impossible," he replied, though a thread of hope was beginning to form in his heart. Eliza watched him, noticing the internal struggle in his eyes. "You are William's father, John. I would never have made this up. I had to raise William alone, but he always knew who you were. When we broke up, I left the city. It was a difficult time, and when I found out I was pregnant, you had moved away, and I couldn't contact you. I never thought I would see you again," Eliza said, adding weight to her words. John felt the gravity of the situation in every syllable. "I should have looked for you, but I thought it would be better this way, that you had moved on." The pain on her face reflected a past full of difficult choices, and John wondered how many wrong decisions he had made himself. The truth always finds a way to come to light, even when we don't expect it, John thought, realizing he was standing before a second chance. As the two stood there amid the weight of the past and the hope of the present, William watched in silence, patiently waiting for them to resolve their differences. John, with a deep sigh, met the boy's gaze. "I need time to process all this, but I want to understand what happened," he said. And Eliza nodded, her expression softening as she offered a hesitant smile. Eliza was still shaken by the reunion with John and his presence there in her house. The revelation that William was his son hung in the air, creating an almost palpable tension. John, unable to contain his frustration and confusion, demanded explanations more firmly. "You should have told me. How could you hide something like this from me?" said John, his voice rising with each word. The surprise and pain of the discovery fueled the anger he could not control. "I didn't know how, John. You had disappeared, and then there was the information that you were sterile. I thought you wouldn't believe me," Eliza replied, her voice also elevated. The frustration in her tone was clear, and her words clashed with the storm of emotions in John. "I could have helped. I could have been there for him," insisted John, unable to accept her justification. He felt betrayed and wronged, as if a crucial part of his life had been stolen without his knowledge. "Do you think it was easy for me raising William alone, afraid of how you would react if you knew?" Eliza replied, her eyes shining with restrained tears. She was tired of carrying the weight of that secret and facing John's anger now. "I was terrified and alone, and I thought you had moved on. There are many more things you don't know. You have no idea what I went through," she continued, her voice now trembling but determined. John, however, was unwilling to accept her reasons as valid. "You denied me the chance to know him, to meet him, to be his father from the beginning," John accused, feeling the depth of the loss her decision caused. "And now I'm here, not knowing what to think, not knowing how to deal with all this." He shook his head, frustration overflowing with every gesture. Eliza felt cornered, knowing that her past decisions had consequences that were now unfolding before her. "I did the best I could with the information I had, but I never wanted to take William away from you," she admitted, trying to find a solution amid the argument. Suddenly, in the middle of the argument, William, who had been listening in silence, began to feel unwell. He took a deep breath, trying to get his parents' attention. "Mom, Dad, I don't feel well," he murmured before collapsing, interrupting the argument with tangible despair. Eliza and John were momentarily paralyzed by shock, but they quickly acted, the fight forgotten in the face of the emergency. "William!" Eliza cried, kneeling beside her son, panic replacing the anger on her face. "We have to take him to the hospital now," said John, picking William up in his arms with determination. The journey to the hospital was a race against time, both parents now focused on a common goal: William's health. Eliza drove as if their lives depended on it while John kept William safe, trying to remain calm despite the internal turmoil. "Please God, let him be okay," John thought, each second feeling like an eternity as they approached the hospital. The urgency of the situation silenced the fight, uniting them in a single purpose to save William. They knew that this emergency would change everything, that the words spoken could wait, but William's health could not. At the hospital, the tension was almost unbearable as Eliza and John waited for news about William. The waiting room was full of anxious faces, but all they could see was the door through which William had been taken. Time seemed to drag on as the minutes passed without news. John, sitting next to Eliza, was lost in thought, trying to process everything that had happened. How did things come to this point? He is just a boy and is already going through this, John thought, feeling the weight of the situation. Beside him, Eliza was restless, her hands moving nervously, intertwining her fingers as her eyes fixed on the door with an almost desperate hope. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his face grave and serious. He approached John and Eliza, who jumped to their feet, panic evident on their faces. "Doctor, how is William?" Eliza asked, her voice failing with anxiety. The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully as he looked at them both. "William has a rare genetic condition," he began, his voice full of concern. "He went into a crisis and needs an urgent transplant to survive." His words were a blow to both of them, and John felt the seriousness of the situation. "What can we do?" "He has to survive, doctor," John said, his voice full of determination. Eliza was by his side, her hands trembling as she held John's arm as if she were holding on to keep from falling apart. "There must be something we can do," she insisted, the urgency in her voice mirroring the hope she could not lose. The doctor shook his head, his expression solemn. "We are looking for a compatible donor as quickly as possible, but the chances are complicated due to the rarity of the condition." His words were harsh, and the impact of the gravity of the situation was inescapable. As the doctor explained the details, John felt the pressure of responsibility, each word a confirmation of how critical the situation was. William was in danger, and time was not on their side. "Is there any chance I could be compatible?" John asked suddenly, the idea coming to mind as he searched for any solution. Eliza looked at him surprised and hopeful as the doctor considered the question. "We will run tests to check that," the doctor replied, the urgency in his voice reflecting the gravity of the situation. As they waited for the test results, the room seemed to shrink around them, the silence full of unspoken questions and palpable fears. John looked at Eliza, determination clear in his eyes. "We need a plan, a way to get what William needs," he said, his voice trying to convey some hope amid the chaos. Eliza nodded, struggling to keep her tears in check as she squeezed John's hand. "We have to believe that things will work out," she replied, knowing that despite the difficulties, they would face this together. The doctor's news was a harsh reminder of how life can change in an instant, and how William's struggle was just beginning. Sometime later, John and Eliza went to give samples to see if they could be compatible with William. The hospital laboratory was bustling with activity, with doctors and nurses rushing back and forth carrying samples and results. John was sitting in an uncomfortable chair, anxiously watching as the doctor analyzed the test results. The air was thick with tension, and each second seemed to last an eternity. Finally, the doctor turned to John and Eliza, his face a mix of complex emotions. "Mr. John, Missy, Eliza, I have the test results," the doctor said, his voice grave. "First, the DNA test confirms that Mr. John is indeed William's biological father." John felt a wave of conflicting emotions. "My God, how is this possible? How can I be worthy of such a grand blessing?" he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. The doctor continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Unfortunately, the tests show that Mr. John cannot donate due to his fragile health condition. It could be fatal for him, and the effort would be in vain, since he might not survive." He paused, letting the information sink in before continuing. "Your heart condition, probably worsened by your recent life circumstances, would make everything riskier." Eliza gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. "What does this mean for William and for John?" "It means we need to find another donor for your son quickly," the doctor replied, the urgency evident in his voice. "As for Mr. John, I strongly recommend that he starts treatment as soon as possible." At that moment, a nurse hurriedly entered the room, her face pale with concern. "Doctor, patient William's condition is rapidly deteriorating. We need immediate intervention." The doctor nodded gravely and turned to leave, but not before casting a significant look at John and Eliza. "I will do what I can for him, but time is running out," said the doctor. "Do whatever you can to save my son, doctor," Eliza pleaded, her eyes filled with tears. John stood up, determined to follow the doctor, but felt a sudden dizziness and had to lean against the wall. Eliza rushed to support him, fear evident in her eyes. "John, you need to take care of yourself too. We can't lose both of you," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't think about myself right now, Eliza." "William needs us," John replied, trying to pull himself together as they watched helplessly as the doctor and nurse rushed to attend to William. Eliza seemed to fight an internal battle, her face twisted in a mix of guilt, fear, and finally resolution. She turned to John, her eyes full of unshed tears. "John, there is something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." John stared at her, confused and apprehensive. "What is it, Eliza? What could be so important now?" Eliza took a deep breath, gathering courage. "William has a twin sister. Her name is Aurora. I gave her up for adoption when they were born." The silence that followed was deafening. John staggered as if he had been dealt a physical blow, his mind struggling to process this shocking revelation. A twin sister? How? Why?" he stammered, unable to form coherent thoughts. "I couldn't raise two babies alone. I was in a very difficult financial situation. I barely had enough to eat and survive. I was so desperate. I didn't know how to find you, how to ask for help. I tried everything, but I couldn't support two babies on my own. Our children. They were in such a difficult situation. I couldn't stand seeing them crying hungry anymore, so I thought I was doing the best for everyone. But now, she might be William's only chance," Eliza explained, the words spilling out quickly, each one filled with pain and regret. John stared at her, a mixture of emotions crossing his face: shock, anger, hope. "A twin sister could be an ideal donor," he murmured, the realization hitting him. At that moment, the sound of alarms coming from William's room pierced the air, causing them both to turn abruptly. The corridor suddenly filled with doctors and nurses rushing towards the room. John and Eliza looked at each other, fear palpable between them. William's condition was worsening, and now they had new information that could be crucial for his survival. Time was running out, and they needed to act quickly. John acted swiftly, his business instincts taking over amid the emotional chaos. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone and began making a series of frantic calls. His voice, usually calm and controlled, now carried a tone of desperate urgency. "I need all available resources now. Find the adoption agency, search the records, do whatever it takes," he commanded, his voice echoing through the hospital corridor. Meanwhile, Eliza stood outside William's room, her eyes shifting between where her son lay unconscious and John, who was pacing back and forth, gesturing furiously on the phone. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. John had mobilized a team of lawyers, private investigators, and even government contacts. The search for Aurora spread like wildfire, with people scouring records, questioning adoption agency staff, and following every possible lead. Any news from the agency? Did the old orphanage provide more information about Aurora? John asked one of his assistants over the phone. Nothing yet, sir. The records from that time are incomplete. We are trying to locate former employees, came the disheartening reply. As the hours passed, frustration and despair began to set in. Every lead that seemed promising ended in a dead end. John, exhausted and heavy-hearted, watched the monitors displaying William's vital signs, each beep reminding him of the precious time slipping through his fingers. Eliza, sitting by the bedside, held William's hand, whispering words of encouragement, her voice choked with unshed tears. What if we don't find her in time, John? What will we do? What if there's no compatible donor? Eliza asked, the fear evident in her voice. John clenched his fists, determination shining in his tired eyes. We can't think like that. We will find her. We have to find her. As the night wore on, William's condition continued to deteriorate. The doctors entered and left the room with increasing frequency, adjusting medications and checking equipment. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy as a storm cloud about to burst. John, now sitting in a chair next to Eliza, held her hand, both united in their silent vigil. Suddenly, John's phone rang, making them jump. He answered quickly, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. "Sir, we found a lead on Aurora, but it's complicated," said the voice on the other end of the line. John felt a lump form in his throat. "Complicated how? Speak quickly, for God's sake." The silence that followed seemed to last in eternity. John and Eliza exchanged anxious glances, both holding their breath. The voice on the phone continued hesitantly. "The woman who adopted her, they moved abroad years ago. We are trying to track down which country, but the records are confusing." John felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The possibility of Aurora being in another country, perhaps on the other side of the world, seemed like a final blow to their already fragile hopes. As soon as he ended the call, John turned to the mother of his children. "Aurora might be living outside the country. We don't know where yet, but my entire team is searching for her at this very moment," he said, feeling panic set in. "Oh no. She can't be so far away, not now," Eliza exclaimed, tears finally overflowing. John, struggling against his own despair, squeezed Eliza's hand. "We won't give up. I will mobilize international contacts. We will find her, even if I have to turn the world upside down." Minutes later, John's phone rang, cutting through the tense silence that hung in the hospital room. He answered quickly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and hope. "Speak," he ordered, not caring about formalities. On the other end of the line, his investigator's voice sounded urgent. "Sir, we found Aurora. She is in a hospital in Spain." John felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. Why would she be in a hospital? He put the phone on speaker so Eliza could hear. "In a hospital. What happened to her?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling with fear and anticipation. The investigator hesitated for a moment before responding. "Sir, ma'am, Aurora is also sick. Very sick." The words fell like a weight on John and Eliza. The investigator continued, his voice laden with concern. "From the records we managed to access, Aurora has been diagnosed with the same genetic condition as William. She also needs an urgent transplant." The room fell silent for a moment, the gravity of the situation weighing on everyone. John stood up abruptly, his mind working frantically to find a solution. "I need to speak with her doctors immediately," John demanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Eliza, silent tears streaming down her face, murmured, "My children, both suffering. And I didn't even know." John quickly arranged a video conference with the medical team in Spain. The laptop screen showed tired and worried faces, reflections of John and Eliza themselves. The Spanish doctor explained Aurora's situation with clinical details that made John's heart tighten. "Aurora's condition is critical. Like her brother, she needs a transplant as soon as possible," the doctor concluded, his voice full of urgency. "Doctor, what if they could donate to each other?" John suggested, his mind desperately searching for a solution. The doctor shook his head sadly. "Unfortunately, both are too weak to be donors at this moment." Frustration and despair threatened to overwhelm John, but he refused to give up. With renewed determination, he turned to William's doctor, who had entered the room during the video conference. "Doctor, is there any possibility that I could donate to one of them?" The doctor frowned, considering the idea. "Well, Mr. John, given that you are the biological father, there is a chance, but with your newly discovered heart condition, it would be extremely risky. I fear you would not survive, as the doctors in your country have advised. But yes, it might work, though your chances of survival are 0, the doctor said. Eliza grabbed John's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "No, John, you can't risk your life like this. We will find someone else. There is still time to search. You have many contacts." John covered her hand with his voice gentle but determined. "If there is a chance to save our children, I need to try." Time seemed to run even faster now. The possibility of saving one child at the cost of the other was unthinkable, but the reality of the situation forced them to consider the unthinkable. John felt the weight of every passing second, knowing that each moment of indecision could cost the life of William or Aurora. "How can we choose, John?" Eliza sobbed, the anguish evident in her voice. John closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "We can't choose, Eliza. We can't choose between our children. I will do the surgery. I don't care about anything else but saving them," he said. John looked intently at the doctors gathered in front of him, his decision already made. "I will donate to both," he declared, his voice firm despite the fear he felt. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of heart monitors. Dr. Ramirez, still on the computer screen, was the first to speak. "Mr. John, I need you to fully understand the risks. Your heart condition makes this procedure extremely dangerous. The chances of survival are—" John interrupted him, raising his hand. "I don't need to know the odds, doctor. I just need to know if there is a possibility to save my children." Eliza held his hand, tears silently streaming down her face. "John, please think carefully. We can't lose you too." John's decision to donate to both his children triggered a race against time. The doctor, still on the video conference, explained the critical situation. "Mr. John, for this to work, we need Aurora to be transported here immediately. Every minute counts." John nodded, his mind already working on the logistics. "I will arrange a private jet right away." However, Eliza raised a crucial point. "What about Aurora's adoptive mother? She needs to authorize this." John's heart sank with the realization. He turned to the doctor. "Doctor, please contact Aurora's mother immediately. Explain the situation. I will talk to her if necessary." The following hours were a whirlwind of frenetic activity. While John arranged transportation, Eliza worked with the doctors to prepare William for the procedure. The doctors in Spain tried to convince Aurora's adoptive mother. However, she was reluctant and afraid. "Mrs. White, I understand your concerns, but this might be Aurora's only chance," said the doctor on the other end of the line. The voice of a woman, trembling and scared, responded, "But the trip, it's so risky. What if something happens during the flight?" John could no longer remain silent. "Please, I know you don't know me, that you have no reason to trust me, but I beg you, let me try to save my biological daughter," he pleaded, his voice full of emotion. There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Mrs. White's voice sounded, "All right, I agree with whatever is necessary to save my girl." With approval obtained, the rescue operation went into action. A medical jet was prepared in record time, equipped with all the necessary equipment to keep Aurora stable during the flight. A medical team specializing in the transport of critical patients was mobilized. "I can't waste any more time. I'm going on that flight," John declared, getting up from his hospital bed. Eliza grabbed his arm, alarmed. "John, you can barely stand. How do you expect to survive this trip?" But John was adamant. "I can't ask our daughter to make this trip alone. I need to be there for her," he replied. Against all medical advice, John boarded the jet to fetch his daughter. It felt like an eternity of preparation until John finally saw the medical team bring Aurora onto the plane. His heart stopped for a moment. There, fragile and pale on a stretcher, was his daughter, the child he never knew existed until a few days ago. Involuntary tears sprang to his eyes as he absorbed every detail of her face. "Aurora," he whispered, the name strange yet fam Aurora on his lips. Despite the tubes and monitors surrounding her, John could see traces of Eliza in her, the shape of her nose, the delicate curve of her cheek, and there, in the determined line of her jaw, he saw himself. A wave of love and protection flooded him, so strong and sudden that it nearly took his breath away. During the flight, John kept his eyes on Aurora. He watched the doctors constantly monitor her vital signs, each beep of the monitors echoing in his mind as a cruel reminder of her fragile condition. But amid the fear, there was hope. Every breath Aurora took, every heartbeat recorded on the monitors, was proof of her strength. The long hours of flight were an agony of worry and physical discomfort. He watched the doctors constantly monitor Aurora's vital signs, each beep of the monitors echoing in his mind. "We're losing altitude," the pilot suddenly shouted hours after takeoff. "Prepare for an emergency landing." John felt panic rise in his throat. "No, no, no, not now, please God, not now." The jet landed with a violent thud at a small airport. John, ignoring his own pain, helped the medical team stabilize Aurora. "Hold on, we're almost there," he murmured, holding the hand of the daughter he barely knew. After agonizing hours of repairs and waiting, the jet finally took off again. When they finally landed at their destination, John was exhausted but determined. Aurora was quickly transferred to the hospital where William was already waiting in the surgical center. John looked at his two children, one on each side. "We're all here now. Let's fight together," he said softly. The anesthetist approached with the mask. "Are you ready, Mr. John?" John nodded, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the past few hours. As the anesthesia began to take effect, his last thought was of gratitude for having managed to bring his family together, even if possibly at the cost of his own life. "Mr. John, it's time," a nurse called, interrupting his thoughts. He nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm ready. Let's save my children." In the surgical center, the tension was palpable. Doctors and nurses moved with precision, preparing for the unprecedented procedure. John was positioned on the operating table, the sound of heart monitors echoing through the room. The anesthetist approached, mask in hand. "Mr. John, I'm going to start the anesthesia now. Do you have any last words before we begin?" John looked at Eliza, who was watching everything through a glass window. "Tell my children that I love them. Even though we didn't have a chance to get to know each other, I would do everything for them again, no matter what happens," he said, as the anesthesia began to take effect. John felt a strange peace envelop him. The voices of the doctors became distant, and his last vision was of the nurse's worried face fading into darkness. The surgery began, a carefully choreographed dance of scalpel and instruments. Hours passed, each minute crucial for the success of the operation and for the survival of John and the children. In the middle of the surgery, the monitors began to beep frantically. "Pressure dropping. We need to stabilize him or we'll lose him," shouted one of the doctors. The chief surgeon remained calm. "Not now, John. Your children need you. Fight!" The team worked feverishly to stabilize John while continuing the delicate process of collecting for the transplant. On the other side of the glass, Eliza watched helplessly, her silent prayers echoing through the hospital corridors. The hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of hope and fear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the chief surgeon looked up. "It's done. We have what we need for both children." But the victory was short-lived. "He's going into shock," shouted the anesthetist. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of frantic activity. The team fought to bring John back, their desperate efforts echoing through the room. Eliza, on the other side of the glass, pressed her hands against her face, unable to look away from the scene before her. "Come on, John," murmured the chief surgeon, performing chest compressions. "You've come this far. Don't give up now." As if responding to the plea, the monitors began to show signs of life. A faint but steady beep filled the room. Hours later, John slowly opened his eyes, the bright light of the hospital room making him blink. Eliza was by his side, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Welcome back," she said softly, holding his hand. John tried to speak, his voice hoarse and weak. "The children?" Eliza smiled through her tears. "They are fine, both of them. You did it, John. You saved our children." Hours later in the hospital corridor, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Eliza, standing beside the hospital bed where John rested, tried to calm her nerves while waiting for Aurora's adoptive mother, who had taken another flight to see her daughter. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor, and soon, a middle-aged woman with red eyes from crying and disheveled hair rounded the corner. "Aurora, where is my Aurora?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Eliza stepped forward, extending her hand in a welcome gesture. "Mrs. White, I'm Eliza, Aurora's biological mother, and this is John, her father," Eliza introduced herself. Mrs. White stopped, her eyes moving between Eliza and John. For a moment, silence hung heavily between them. Then, to everyone's surprise, she knelt beside John's wheelchair, taking his hands in hers. "Mr. John," she began, her voice choked with emotion, "I have no words to express what I am feeling at this moment. What you did, the courage, the love, the sacrifice you showed, is something I have never seen before in my life. When I adopted Aurora, I promised myself I would do everything in my power to protect and love her. But you, who barely knew her, even though you were her biological father, risked everything, your health, your life, to save her. This goes beyond anything I could have imagined or hoped for. I was desperate. The doctors couldn't find a compatible donor. I had no information about Aurora's biological family. I was living a distress that barely fit within me. Then you embarked on this dangerous journey, flying across oceans, facing medical complications, and the unknown, all for a girl you had never seen before. This shows such a deep and unconditional paternal love that it leaves me speechless. It is the same as I would do for Aurora if I were compatible. I know it must have been a difficult decision, risking your own life, leaving behind everything you knew, all for a chance to save not only Aurora, but also your son William. This generosity of spirit, this ability to love so completely two children you barely knew, is truly inspiring. You not only saved Aurora's life, but also gave me a life lesson I will never forget. You showed me that true love knows no bounds, doesn't stop at obstacles, doesn't hesitate in the face of danger. When I think about the anguishing hours you must have spent on that plane, caring for Aurora even with your own health failing, yet still determined to push forward, it moves me deeply. And soon after you underwent risky surgery, willing to give a part of yourself to save your children. This selflessness, this altruism, is something rare and precious in this world. I want you to know that no matter what happens from now on, you have already done more for Aurora than I could have ever asked. You gave her a chance at life, a future opportunity, and not only that, you gave her an example of love and courage that will inspire her for the rest of her life. I know our situation is complicated. There are so many emotions involved, so many intertwined stories, but at this moment, I want you to know that I am eternally grateful for what you did. You are not just Aurora's biological father. You are a true hero. I promise you, Mr. John, that I will do everything in my power to honor your sacrifice. Aurora will know this story. She will know of the incredible love her biological father has for her. And I promise that whatever the outcome of this surgery, I will keep the doors open for you and Eliza to be part of her life. You have given us a lesson in love, courage, and sacrifice that has transformed not only Aurora's life, but mine as well. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for being the father Aurora deserves. The hero she needed at this critical moment. May God bless you and protect you during your treatment, and know that no matter what happens, You have already earned an eternal place in our hearts. Thank you, Mr. John. Thank you for loving Aurora so deeply and unconditionally, she said. As she finished her words, Mrs. White had tears streaming freely down her face, and both John and Eliza were visibly moved. The hospital corridor, once a place of tension and fear, now seemed filled with a sense of love and gratitude that transcended all the complications of their unique situation. The weeks following the surgery were a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty. While William and Aurora recovered quickly, gaining strength each day, John struggled to remain stable. His body, already weakened by age and the risky procedure, seemed to be losing the battle. Eliza and Mrs. White took turns keeping constant watch, their faces marked by worry and sleepless nights. "He's going to make it, isn't he?" William asked Eliza, his voice trembling slightly. Eliza forced a smile, gently stroking her son's hair. "Your father is the strongest man I know. He won't give up now," she replied. It was on one of those nights of vigil that the doctor burst into the room, his eyes shining with renewed hope. "We have a chance. There's a new treatment, experimental but promising," he quickly explained. "A revolutionary therapy that combined cellular regeneration with nanotechnology, something that could not only treat John's heart condition, but potentially reverse the damage caused." John, even in his weakened state, managed a faint smile. "Once again, doctor, I'm in your hands." Eliza held John's hand, tears of relief and hope shining in her eyes. "We will face this together, John, as a family." The following days were an emotional roller coaster. The treatment was intense, with John undergoing exhausting sessions that seemed to drain his last bit of strength. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, signs of improvement began to appear. His color returned, his breathing became easier, and the spark in his eyes, which had dimmed, began to reignite. Aurora, still recovering, insisted on visiting John every day. "Daddy, you need to get better soon. We have so much time to make up for," Aurora said, her voice soft but determined. John smiled, feeling a renewed strength flow through him at his daughter's words. "I'm doing my best, dear. For you, I will do the impossible." While John fought for recovery, Mrs. White made a decision that would change the course of their lives. After long conversations with Eliza and moments of deep reflection, she decided she could not separate Aurora from her newly discovered family. "I'm going to move here. Aurora deserves to have all of us in her life," she announced one day, her voice firm with conviction. Eliza embraced Mrs. White, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "You are already part of our family. You will always be Aurora's mother. DNA doesn't matter. All that matters is that you took care of her when I couldn't. I can never thank you enough for the love you gave Aurora," Eliza said. Mrs. White returned the hug, feeling a weight lifted from her shoulders. "And you will always be her mother too. Aurora now has double the love," she replied. The weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, John's recovery became more evident. The revolutionary treatment was working wonders, not only treating his heart condition, but revitalizing his entire body. He began taking short walks down the hospital corridors, first supported by Eliza, then on his own, and finally with William and Aurora by his side. "Look at you three," Eliza commented one day, watching John walk hand in hand with the children. "Who would have thought that lonely beggar would become the father of the year?" she said, making John smile, a sound that was becoming more frequent. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" he replied. When John's discharge day arrived, marking not the end but the beginning of a new journey, the family now expanded to include Mrs. White gathered at the hospital entrance. John, standing without assistance, looked at each face around him, his heart overflowing with gratitude and love. "So where are we going now?" William asked, his voice full of anticipation. John smiled, pulling everyone into a group hug. "Home, my loves. Finally, we're all going home," he replied. And as they walked out of the hospital towards a future that once seemed impossible, John reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them there. From a lonely millionaire disguised as a beggar to a family man surrounded by love, he had discovered the true meaning of wealth and legacy. And there, with Eliza by his side, William and Aurora safe in his arms, and Mrs. White completing the family circle, John knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together as the family they were all always meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you with us. Now you can click on the links appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.